This is a spot where a leopard had had its kill, and unless you come really quickly before the remains fall to the ground, you don't find very much, because it's immediately scattered by the hyenas and jackals that come to any such place. What you do typically find is the skull. Because this is a resistant part, the teeth and the lower jaw are not very palatable, and these are bits, and particularly the horns, these are the bits that remain.
The sad truth of what was really going on became apparent in one of the fossils.
One of the really interesting pieces of evidence that came from the Swartkrans fossils was in the form of this piece of skull. It comes from the back of the skull of a child, maybe 10 or 11 years old, and it has 2 holes punctured into the parietal bones. Oddly enough, the spacing between these 2 holes is matched almost exactly by the typical spacing of the lower canines of a leopard. So a possible reconstruction that we suggested was that this child was killed by a leopard and dragged away to the feeding place in the lower part of the Swartkrans cave. And this, like so many of the other fossils at Swartkrans, constitutes nothing more than the remains of cat's dinners.
So walking upright helped us to get a move on, but we were still cat food.
For an ape man living in the relatively open savanna, I think life must have been fairly scary. Not only were they fairly small creatures, but they had very little in the way of natural defenses. They didn't have large teeth, fangs, or claws. And there was a great variety of dangerous predators always waiting around them. Apart from the carnivores that we are so familiar with today, like the lion and the leopard and several hyenas, there was a whole range of other carnivores, such as the saber-toothed cats, always skulking around, waiting for an easy meal.
But predators weren't the only thing to make life tough for the Australopithecus. Two and a half million years ago, the weather took a turn for the worse. It got colder and drier. It was the start of the Ice Age, and the changing climate had a profound effect on our ancestors.
Well, it seems that as conditions became more and more difficult for survival, 2 different strategies were attempted. The one was used by the robust ape men, and they had a very characteristic skull, usually with a flat face, a wide flat face, and this strategy seems to have been one of toughening yourself up, in that way trying to overcome the really difficult conditions. Altogether, a tough-looking, robust individual. That was the one alternative. The other, which occurred in our own human and pre-human lineage, was simply an enlargement in the size of the brain. And this is reflected from the beginning of the human lineage. And in the case of these creatures, they seem to live by their wits rather than by their strength. And of the 2 options, this proved to be the one that came through.
The robust ape men became extinct, whilst the descendants of the larger brain species moved out of Africa and began to extend their range across the world. For those that went as far as Northern Europe, for the first time they had to cope with permafrost and freezing winters. The landscape was dominated by cold weather specialists. Megaloceros, a giant deer, woolly rhinos, and herds of magnificent mammoths. The only primate that could survive in these conditions was a highly specialized, cold-adapted human. It was a Neanderthal. talking with beasts, the Neanderthals were so close to modern humans that actors, rather than animation, were used to recreate them. But it still required 3 hours in makeup to be transformed.
Neanderthal features, and particularly the features of their face, were an important part of their total adaptation. What you would see is a jaw that sticks forward, that juts forward, very large eyebrow ridges, a low forehead. The very large fleshy nose on Neanderthals is very interesting because it's in fact an adaptation to cold climate. The big nose, in fact, warmed and humidified air as it was going into their lungs and helped them maintain very high activity rates in extremely cold weather. In fact, I suspect their noses were running a good portion of the time, and the Neanderthals probably weren't very pretty to look at when they were engaging in physical activity. They may have been pretty ugly people, actually.
Nice, excellent. I beg your pardon.
Nice.
The Neanderthals may have looked unsavory, but they certainly weren't stupid. In fact, their brains were somewhat larger than modern humans, and the fossil record seems to suggest they certainly weren't cat food anymore. Evidence that their relationship with animals had changed has been found on the island of Jersey in the English Channel. Archaeologist Dr. Paul Callow has been studying the remains found at the base of this cliff to piece together what went on here. Hundreds of bones have been found here, and they tell a remarkable story.
Now, what's so special about this place is that during the excavations, huge numbers of mammoth and woolly rhino bones were found. There were some other species as well, but those were the most important ones. We have an example here of one of the teeth that was found of a mammoth. Now, it wasn't so much the sheer quantity of them that's important. Instead, it was the way they were organized within the site.
During the excavations in 1969, archaeologists were astonished to find animal bones like these stacked neatly together, rather than all jumbled up.
It's extremely unusual to find bones like this, and it really does indicate human intervention of some kind. And in fact, we can find the culprit, because there's plenty of evidence. This is the kind of tool that Neanderthal man was making. And if we look at some of the bones, we can find the sort of scratch marks that were made when stone tools were used to cut the flesh off the bone.
It was not only scratch marks found on the bones. When the teeth of Neanderthals were discovered at the site, it seemed certain that Neanderthals had been involved in some kind of organized slaughter. But the mystery was, how did they get so many of these giant animals into this location? Dr. Callow believes the cliff provides a clue.
Now imagine, instead of today's coastal scene, a vast grassy plain extending for many kilometers out there. And on the plateau, a herd of mammoth, perhaps a few woolly rhino grazing. Now, if Neanderthal man could get behind them and drive them this way towards the headland on which I'm sitting, once he'd cut off their retreat and got them moving this way, there was really nowhere for them to go except downwards into the ravine here. Now, of course, we don't really know how Neanderthals would have persuaded mammoths to move in this way. We don't really know, of course, what would spook a mammoth even, for sure. However, we do know one technology that Neanderthals had, which would certainly have been very useful, and that is fire. In the ravine itself, there are masses of charcoal and burnt bone. Now, with fire, you light it behind the mammoths When the wind's in the right direction, they really don't have any option but to come in this direction.
Here was a primate that had swapped fruit eating for meat eating. And it just so happens that these professional killers were around when the giant mammals started to disappear. Having survived some of the hardest conditions on Earth, magnificent creatures like the woolly rhinos, the woolly mammoths, and Megaloceros all became extinct as the last ice age ended. Although the Neanderthals might look guilty, there are other suspects in the case. Cousins of the Neanderthals reached Europe just at the time the great mammals started to go extinct. Instead of being cold adapted, their bodies were taller and leaner than the Neanderthals. Their skulls were higher and more rounded, with bony chins and a lack of brow ridges. They were called Cro-Magnon. They were modern humans.
That's like where we were running from.
On the surface, the Cro-Magnons looked ill-equipped to survive the harsh conditions. They had no physical adaptations to the cold.
Ice Age environments were extremely tough. With our very thin tropical bodies, humans could not survive up here. If I were a naked human, I would be dead within an hour. Instead, we developed complex cultures and complex technologies in order to survive. Modern technologies use synthetic fibers. In the Ice Age, what they had was animals. They were able to kill animals, use the meat for food, use the hides for clothing, use the bones and antlers to make tools. And with those simple things put together in a very sophisticated way, people were able to live in these very difficult environments.
The DV, you've got the DV there.
Cro-Magnons were inventors. They had a far greater range of tools than the Neanderthals and used a variety of different materials. They survived because they were adaptable.
Wow. Neanderthal tools were made of chipped stone. They made simple tools for chopping and cutting wood. Tools like this could be used for scraping hides and processing animal materials. And of course, spear points were used for hunting. Modern humans, on the other hand, also made simple stone tools, but they were more efficient. But importantly, they mounted them on handles so that it allowed them to be used with great mechanical advantage. In scraping a hide, for example, a handle gives you a lot of advantage. And in addition, they made tools out of other materials, such as antler and bone. What you would be using if you were living 30,000 years ago in Europe is spears tipped with antler points like this. But if you feel the points on these, they are razor sharp, and you could penetrate, you could easily penetrate very, very deeply. Initially, they were on spears that you threw by hand, but at about 20,000 years ago, people started using the spear thrower, or atlatl, and how that worked is you had a socket at the end of a very large feathered spear.
So like a...
Yeah, and just hold it more or less parallel to the ground. It'll flex up. It'll actually go up initially.
Okay.
All right. Way to go. Okay.
Whoa, man. Whoa. Isn't that pretty awesome?
They represented a really revolutionary increase in firepower, so to speak, because there you could kill animals at a very significant distance and safely. One of the problems Neanderthals had was they had throwing spears, but often the spears weren't sharp. They didn't have those real sharp tips. So you just wounded an animal, and then you had to move in close.